What if the world's most important oil choke point suddenly stopped mattering? At least for one country. The Strait of Hormuz has always been the ultimate pressure point of global energy. Nearly a fifth of the world's oil flows through it. For decades, any disruption here meant instant crisis, especially for Asia. But this time, something feels different. China, the largest importer of Gulf oil, is not reacting with panic. No emergency warnings, no aggressive diplomatic scrambling. Instead, Beijing is projecting quiet confidence, almost as if this scenario was expected. And that raises a deeper question. How can the country most dependent on Hormuz be the least vulnerable to it? Behind the scenes, China has been preparing for this moment for years, not with one solution, but with a layered strategy designed to absorb shocks, redirect supply, and reduce dependence entirely. But this is where it gets complicated, because this isn't just about surviving a disruption, it's about reshaping the global energy balance itself. This shift did not happen overnight. It was built quietly, over decades. For years, China followed a familiar path: rapid growth, rising oil demand, increasing dependence on Middle Eastern supply routes, especially through Hormuz. By the early 2010s, this dependency looked like a strategic weakness waiting to be exploited. Beijing saw the risk early. Every crisis in the Gulf, from tanker attacks to sanctions, reinforced the same pattern. Energy vulnerability equals geopolitical vulnerability. So China began adjusting. Not publicly, not dramatically, but systematically. First, it started diversifying suppliers, pulling oil not just from the Gulf, but from Russia, Central Asia, and even sanctioned states others avoided. Then came infrastructure, pipelines, storage facilities, strategic reserves. And then something unexpected changed the equation entirely. China's electric vehicle push, initially seen as environmental policy, began cutting directly into oil demand. But this is where the pattern becomes clear. China wasn't just reacting to crises, it was preparing for a world where choke points like Hormuz could be bypassed altogether. And what happens next reveals the real strategy. At first glance, the situation looks simple. The Strait of Hormuz faces disruption, global markets tense, Asian economies brace for impact. Countries like Japan and South Korea move quickly, cut consumption, issue warnings, prepare for shortages. But China responds differently. No visible panic, no sudden policy shock. Instead, subtle moves begin to surface. Fuel exports are quietly restricted, domestic supply is preserved, strategic reserves remain untouched, for now. At the same time, imports don't stop, they shift. Oil continues flowing in, from Russia, from Central Asia, from alternative maritime routes less exposed to Hormuz. The system doesn't collapse, it adapts. And then comes the critical detail. China isn't just relying on supply continuity, it's relying on reduced demand. Electric vehicles are already cutting into fuel consumption at scale. Entire segments of transport no longer depend on oil at all. But this is where the story shifts. Because China is not solving a short-term disruption, it is testing whether a major economy can function, even temporarily, without its most critical oil artery. And that changes the strategic calculation entirely. To understand why this matters, you have to look at geography and control. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping route, it is a leverage point. Whoever threatens it can disrupt global energy flows, spike prices, and pressure entire economies within days. For decades, that vulnerability shaped strategy across Asia. But China is now shifting that equation. By reducing reliance on seaborne oil, it is weakening the power of choke points altogether. Pipelines from Russia and Central Asia move energy across land, beyond naval control. Domestic coal and renewables power an electricity grid that barely depends on imports, and a massive EV fleet is steadily disconnecting transport from oil entirely. This creates something rare: strategic insulation. Not total independence, but enough flexibility to absorb shocks that would cripple others. And this is where things escalate, because if Hormuz loses its leverage over China, it doesn't just change energy security, it changes power dynamics across the entire region. What makes this moment significant is not the disruption itself, but how closely it aligns with long-term Chinese planning. For decades, Chinese strategists operated on a simple assumption: energy imports are a strategic liability. Not because supply would disappear, but because control lies elsewhere. So the objective was never full independence. That was unrealistic. The objective was resilience. And that explains the pattern we're seeing now. Electric vehicles were not just about emissions. They reduce oil demand at scale. Renewables were not just about climate targets, they localize energy production. Strategic reserves were not just backups, they buy time during crises. Each layer serves the same function: delay, absorb, adapt. Even supplier diversification follows this logic. By sourcing oil from multiple countries, including sanctioned ones, China reduces the risk of coordinated disruption. But here's the deeper insight. China doesn't need to replace Hormuz completely. It only needs to reduce its importance enough that disruption no longer forces immediate concessions. And that shifts the balance of power quietly, but significantly. But the other side tells a very different story. China's position may look strong, but it is not invulnerable. Despite all the diversification, a large share of its oil still originates from the Gulf. Hormuz may matter less, but it has not disappeared from the equation. Strategic reserves can buy time, but only temporarily. Estimates suggest a few months of coverage, not a permanent solution. And pipelines, while critical, have limits. They cannot fully replace the scale of seaborne flows, at least not yet. There's also a structural constraint. China's domestic oil production is rising, but not enough to change the bigger picture. Unlike the United States, it cannot trigger a shale-style surge to offset external shocks. So from this perspective, China is not escaping the system. It is managing its exposure within it. But this is where the real tension lies. Because even partial insulation changes behavior, and when a country feels less vulnerable, it starts taking positions it previously avoided. If China can absorb a Hormuz disruption, even partially, the ripple effects go far beyond its borders. First, energy markets begin to split. Countries like Japan and South Korea remain highly exposed. Any disruption hits them immediately, forcing demand cuts, price shocks, and economic slowdown. China, meanwhile, moves differently. Slower demand growth, flexible supply routes, strategic reserves acting as a buffer. That divergence changes pricing power. Oil exporters can no longer assume uniform demand pressure across Asia. Discounts, side deals, and alternative trade flows begin to reshape the market. And then there's the geopolitical layer. If Hormuz loses leverage over China, the strategic importance of controlling that choke point starts to shift. Naval dominance matters less, while land-based energy corridors gain importance. But for the rest of the world, the impact becomes personal. Higher volatility, uneven price shocks, supply uncertainty that doesn't hit everyone equally. And this is where the future starts to take shape. What happens next depends on one critical variable: duration. If disruption in Hormuz is short-lived, the system stabilizes. China leans on reserves, adjusts flows, and returns to normal without major damage. But if it extends, the real test begins. Scenario 1. Escalation. China accelerates everything already in motion: more pipeline deals, faster renewable expansion, tighter control over fuel exports. Oil demand declines faster than expected. The global market begins adjusting to a China that simply needs less. And that would permanently weaken the strategic power of choke points like Hormuz. Scenario 2. Controlled de-escalation. Supply routes reopen, but the lesson remains. China doubles down quietly, continuing to build a system designed to withstand the next disruption, not avoid it. Either way, one trend becomes clear. China is not trying to win control over Hormuz, it is trying to make it irrelevant. And if that strategy succeeds, the next global energy crisis may not look like the last one, because this time, not everyone will be equally affected.